Hi, my name's Julian and I'm the author of The Squirrel's Tale, a children's book that I wrote inspired by my daughter and the operation she had to have as a toddler. I'm going to read you the story. Hazel was a bouncy little squirrel with twinkly eyes, a twitchy nose and a long bushy tail. She lived with her dad in the middle of the great forest. Every morning after breakfast, Hazel went out to explore. The great forest was full of exciting things to see and do. Hazel might find a nest of baby birds to play with, or some juicy berries to feast on. She'd leap from tree to tree with her long bushy tail flicking, yelling to her friends as she bounced along. "Hello, woodpecker! Hello, bear!" At the very edge of the forest was a field of woolly sheep. Hazel liked to tease them by dropping acorns on them. "Wake up, sleepyheads," she would call. At the end of each day, Hazel returned to the safety of the cosy nest, where Dad would make walnut pancakes with honey for supper. With a full belly, Hazel would wrap herself in Dad's long bushy tail and tell him all about the day's adventures. Nowhere felt cosier, nowhere felt safer than snuggled up in Dad's tail. One day, Hazel came across the biggest tree she'd ever seen. She knew it must be the big, enormous oak that Dad had often told her about. It was the oldest, tallest tree in the forest, and Hazel knew she just had to climb it. The big, enormous oak was unlike any tree Hazel had climbed before. Its twisty trunk was covered in thick bark that was hard for her claws to grip. A little higher, the bark was green and slippery with moss. Up and up Hazel went, dodging and darting through the tangled branches, climbing higher and higher. Finally, she reached the very top and peeped out through the leaves. She looked all around at the forest, stretching as far as she could see. Never before had Hazel climbed so high. She felt as though she could touch the clouds. Hazel didn't want to stop looking, but the sun was going down, and her rumbling tummy reminded her it was time to go home. Looking downwards to the forest floor, Hazel felt scared. Climbing down was always trickier than climbing up, and the big enormous oak was so tall and twisty. She was hopping carefully from one branch to another when suddenly she heard the noise that all squirrels fear. Crack! The twig beneath her snapped, and before she knew what was happening, Hazel was tumbling through the air. Leaves and branches rushed by as her long bushy tail whirled behind her. Down and down she fell until... thump! She landed in a pile of leaves. Feeling dizzy and sore, Hazel looked up at the big enormous oak and spotted something caught on one of the twisty branches. Something long and bushy. It was Hazel's tail. Poor Hazel began to cry. Hazel's sobs disturbed an old owl who lived in the trunk of the big enormous oak. He looked sleepily out of his hole and called out, "What's the matter, little hamster?" Hazel stopped crying and stared up at the owl in surprise. "Hamster," she said. "I'm not a hamster, I'm a squirrel." "A squirrel?" The owl frowned. "Who ever heard of a squirrel without a long bushy tail?" At that, poor Hazel burst into tears and ran home as fast as she could. Hazel ran through the trees and scrambled up to the nest to tell Dad the terrible news. Dad hugged Hazel tight and listened while he thought about what to do. "I need my tail for jumping and balancing," Hazel sobbed. "Who ever heard of a squirrel without a tail? Al thought I was a hamster." They hugged for a long time. After a while, Dad made supper, and Hazel started to feel a little better. Dad tucked her into bed and stroked her head until she fell fast asleep. Later that night, Dad went out into the dark forest. He picked blueberries and raspberries and found 2 long twigs. He crept across the field and collected loose scraps of wool from the sleeping sheep. He bundled it all up and carried it home. Back in the nest, Dad set to work. He crushed the berries to make juice. He used the juice to dye the wool purple and red. Then, using the twigs as needles, he started to knit. All night long, Dad knitted and knitted. Just as the sun was rising, it was finished at last. A long, bushy tail in Hazel's favourite colours. Hazel woke up feeling glum. She went over to the mirror and looked sadly at herself with no tail. Dad popped his head around the door. "Close your eyes, Hazel," he said. "I have a surprise." She tried not to peep as Dad came up behind her with a rustling sound. When it was time to look, Hazel could not believe what she saw in the mirror. It was the longest, bushiest, stripiest tail she had ever seen. She jumped around and flicked her tail, flashing red and purple stripes behind her. Grabbing an acorn bun, Hazel rushed out to show her friends her beautiful, long, new, bushy tail. Everyone loved it, and nobody ever called Hazel a hamster again. The end.